Excellent. So I will start with some of the technical content about doing this online. So pursuant to the provisions of California Governor's Executive Order N2920 issued on March 17th, 2020 to prevent the spread of COVID-19, this meeting will be held by virtual teleconference only with no physical location. The meeting will be broadcast on cable TV channel 26 and live on the Midpin Media Center at midpinmedia.org. Members of the public who wish to participate can do so by email, phone, or computer. To ensure participation in a particular item, we suggest calling in or connecting online 15 minutes before the item you wish to speak on. For written communications, please send an email to planning.commission@cityofpaloalto.org. Spoken comments via a computer will be accepted through the Zoom teleconference meeting. To address the board, go to zoom.us/join, zoom.us/join. Meeting ID is 925-9144-5934. You will be asked to enter an email address and name. We request that you identify yourself by name, as this will be visible online and be used to notify you that it's your turn to speak. When you wish to speak on an agenda item, click on Raise Hand. The moderator will activate and unmute speakers in turn. When called, please limit your remarks to the time allotted. The timer will be shown on the computer to help you keep track of your time. Spoken comments using a smartphone will be accepted through Zoom teleconference meeting. To address the board, download the Zoom application onto your phone from the Apple App Store or Google Play Store and enter the meeting ID 925-9144-5934. Please follow the previous steps. Spoken public comments using a phone call, use phone number 1-669-900-6833 and enter meeting ID 925-9144-5934. When you wish to speak on an agenda item, hit *9 on your phone so that we know you wish to speak. You will be asked to provide your first and last name before addressing the board. You will be advised how long you have to speak. When called, please limit your remarks to the agenda item and time allotted. You can also find this information on the last page of the agenda. To better facilitate public comments, at the beginning of the meeting, our meeting host, Vin Nguyen, will identify each person with a raised hand by name or last 4 digits of your phone number and request that you state your name and the agenda item you wish to speak on. If you wish to speak under any item not on the agenda, please state your intent to speak under oral communications. When it is your time to speak during public comment, you will be identified and provided 3 minutes to speak. Any callers with blocked numbers will wait until the end of the speaker's portion. The host will unmute them one at a time and all will be asked to speak. All right, that was a lot, but that is how we are able to meet on the Zoom call. So at this time, Vin, do you want to go through any, well, we don't have any attendees dialed in at the moment.
Yes, we have no public comments at this time, so you may proceed with the agenda.
Okay. So at this point, we should call the meeting to order and do a roll call.
Okay, so I'll begin the roll call. Chair Templeton.
Present.
Vice Chair Rupavar.
Present.
Commissioner Awcheck.
Present.
Commissioner Heckman.
Here, not there.
Commissioner Lowing.
Present.
Commissioner Lowing.
Present.
Commissioner Riggs.
Here.
Commissioner Suma. Commissioner Suma.
Present, sorry.
We have a quorum, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We still have no one as an attendee, so oral communications are going once, going twice. All right, I guess we should close that portion of the meeting and review the agenda. Are there any changes, additions, or deletions to the agenda?
I have no changes or deletions to suggest, Chair.
All right. Let's move on to the city official report then. Thank you.
Great. And I just want to share one cool Zoom trick that I learned while listening to the budget hearing, surprisingly, which is that if you're on mute and you click and hold your space bar, it will let you talk. And then when you unhold your space bar, you go back on mute. So I thought that was really cool. So I figured I would share it with you all. You may already know that because you may be Zoom aficionados, but something new to pass along. Well, I do want to give a little bit of an update on what we just heard today. If you were listening in, and if you weren't, from the City Council regarding the planning and transportation budget. And we do have both Sylvia Starlack and Nathan Barrett on the line from the Office of Transportation, so they can update on transportation, both budget-wise, but also in regards to different initiatives that they've been working on. So one of the things that Council did vote to actually do, so as I was mentioning before we got started, the way the Council is approaching the budget is they are both making motions to maybe add different items back into the budget or to remove them from the budget, and then voting on those with the majority vote, so 4 votes to carry that motion and to have that become, part of the proposed budget that will be adopted. I believe they're meeting yesterday, today. They may find another third time to meet. They'll have their meeting next Monday, and the goal is that by the 26th of May, the staff are able to bring back all of their proposals and adjustments and everything back for consideration, and then work on those kind of proposals through June 22nd, when the budget for the next fiscal year will actually be adopted. And I'm sure many of you have heard that the deficit that we're planning for is $39 million, so a fairly significant impact to the city over the next year or two. But we're very fortunate that Council did vote 4-3 to restore the long-range planning and housing program to its full budget. And so that means we hopefully can move forward with some additional work in the long-range planning and housing functions in the Planning and Development Services Department. We also had a parking lot item, which is to look a little bit closely at our inspection services. And as you may know, when folks are looking to open up buildings or move back into their buildings or start new businesses, there are inspections needed. And so we had proposed in the budget a 50% reduction in our inspection services in order to try to balance the budget. And so kind of taking a look at what we could do to maybe either restore some of those or monitor those or try to ensure that there aren't disruptions as folks are opening their business. So that's a parking lot item we'll be working on and bringing back. Coming up in the future in just 2 weeks on May 26th, we are going to have our first virtual NVCAP meeting. So we're really looking forward to getting together. We're trying it out, a 2-hour meeting instead of a 3-hour, and hopefully being able to really share feedback from all the working group members on the proposals, both the proposals shared by the working group members and designed by them, as well as the proposals prepared by the professional planners. And so we'll kind of get a really a round robin discussion, and then also plan for how we can meet in June. So I'm really excited about that. I'm a little nervous for the Zoom meeting, but if the XCAP can do it successfully, I'm fairly confident that NVCAP can also have a successful virtual meeting. So if you want more virtual meetings, Tuesday, May 26th, from 5:30 to 7:30, you can tune in for a little bit or for a little bit of time, a lot of time if you choose. Also happy to report kind of just in the operations of our department, we have really switched on our online permitting system. And so folks are submitting applications both for planning, for building, and also other departments like fire, utilities online. And we're really able to serve our customers virtually. So we're really excited about that. If you have friends, colleagues who are thinking about doing home improvements or other work, we're open for business 24 hours a day, really online. And in addition, construction has been allowed. So since we last met, I believe the construction, the shelter in place has allowed construction activities of all kinds to move forward in our county and in our city. And so we're doing inspections, we're out there in the field helping those projects move along. Coming up to City Council next week, we do have one informational item, which is an ADU quarterly report. And just, you can look at the report right now. It's already published as an informational report in the City Council agenda. Just to give you a sense, in 2015, we had 10 new applications filed for accessory dwelling units. And in 2019, we had 75 applications filed for accessory dwelling units. And later this month, you will have an item that's looking at even streamlining further our ADU ordinance. And also we hope to make some other changes to hopefully make it easier for folks who want to get ADUs developed and approved, that we can help them with that. There's also going to be an appeal of a director's decision, an IR, a two-story home that will be on the council consent agenda on Monday on the 18th. And then we will be bringing forward some more items to the City Council in June, which I can update you on later. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nathan Baird and to Sylvia Starlack from the Office of Transportation.
Can I interrupt before we do that?
Yes, if there's any questions or comments.
No, Rachel, I just want to say how excited, this is Commissioner Riggs, how excited and proud of you I am and the department for doing the virtual permitting and really scaling up fast. I think it's really important. We've talked about it in theory in academia for a long time, and it's just amazing to see how quickly you've gone to e-permitting full force. So kudos to you and the rest of the staff. I think it's really important.
I take that and I will share with staff. There are many people who've been thinking about this for, as you said, a couple of years even, and it's the groundwork they laid. We were really able to say, okay, now's the time, let's do it. So we're really happy, and I will share that with them. They'll be very, feel that very warmly. So thank you very much.
It looks like Commissioner Lowing also has a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I was watching the section of the budgets for planning and transportation today, and a lot before that too. But I just want to comment that the 4-3 vote doesn't mean the sentiment was 4-3. It was substantially procedural in the sense that the 3 who voted just wanted to look at it later in the context of all other ads. But I think there was general agreement that we needed the person there who was going to help drive and think about housing policies. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, that's a great comment. There's been a little bit, I think, of discussion about what it means to have something go to the parking lot and what it means to have it be an actual budget recommendation. So I think that may continue, unfortunately. So if there are no comments or questions, do we want Chair to hear from the Office of Transportation?
I think it would be great to go over to the transportation team. Thank you.
Nate, do you want me to go first, or you want to go?
Why don't you go first? I think you can probably give the fuller update on the council proceedings the last couple of days, as well as I think your items are a little bit more discussed a little bit more as well.
Okay. Well, I can't begin to summarize the council meetings for the budget. It has been really emotional and intense. They have a very heavy lift. I don't envy them. What I did gather from today's meeting is that it looks like the Crosstown and possibly the Embarcadero shuttles will both be cut. And we did have a parking lot item, and that is to revisit TMA funding and how much it will receive for next year. That's my very short update on budget. I think, did I miss something else in there? I think
that about covers it. I think I'll talk about parking a little bit.
Yeah, I'm going to let you handle the parking piece. Okay, great. So then I have 2 program updates. The first is that, and some of you may know this, hopefully you all know this, that we did launch last Friday our new Shared Streets pilot program. The program reserves selected streets on our bicycle network for local traffic only. And the idea is to reduce through traffic so that pedestrians, bicyclists, and other non-motorists can maintain physical distancing while exercising or using the street, so they can pass each other and have fewer conflicts with vehicles. We also included on that website an online survey for feedback and for folks to recommend other streets on our bike network for this kind of a treatment. And I wanted to give you a couple results from the summary so far. About 50 people have responded, so it's not a lot. So, take it for what it's worth. But 85% of the total responders have used these streets for at least one of these streets for walking or exercise. 89% of the responders think that residents are often or occasionally using the roadway on the shared streets to maintain physical distancing. So people are actually using the space. 58% of the responders have noticed less traffic on these segments, and 63% of the responses shared that the Shared Streets program made these streets feel more safe and inviting for walking and bicycling. And then 50% of the people who responded did suggest additional streets to be included. And then I just have a couple of samples of feedback, that direct feedback people said. Please keep on supporting alternative modes of transportation. We've seen with COVID how pollution and harmful emissions got reduced. We're hoping we can keep doing that after we go back to normal. Someone else said, I'd love to see this be more permanent and for CalAV to become a completely car-free zone and enjoyable public space. And someone else said, sidewalks are often too crowded, making it nearly impossible to maintain distancing without walking in the center of the street. So people are using these streets and they like it. So that's my first update. My second update is,
Hey, Sylvia, before we move on, I again want to just provide encouragement and positive feedback. I mean, this has been, most people don't know, this has been my primary research area for 15 years, particularly studying Dutch streets. And so I couldn't be more proud of Palo Alto of forging forward with kind of a naked streets, Hans Monderman type concept. So congratulations to staff. For the record, thank you so much for pursuing this.
Thanks. This next item really enhances the shared streets concept, and really supports everybody right now as we're sheltering in place. And I mentioned it last week, our Safe Routes to School team's been focusing on revamping how they're delivering support to the community on education and evaluation. And they've launched 4 new things. One I mentioned last week, but I have an update. They launched an online module for our 5th grade bicycle safety education program. We normally go into the schools and educate kids face to face, but we can't do that now, and now it's online. We've wanted to do it for many years. This module launched last week, and it's seen more than 100 students accessing the curriculum. The 8th grade getting to high school online module is going to launch soon, so I'm looking forward to that. The third item is that our biking from preschool to parenthood adult presentation has been shared with about 50 students and their families. So we are really experiencing some interest from young families in how to kind of adopt a biking lifestyle early when they have little kids. So that's great. And we also, our final offering is the new one-on-one virtual and optionally bilingual. If you speak Spanish, you could do this in Spanish, bike safety consultations. And these are intended to address the significant growth in family bicycling we're seeing right now across Palo Alto. And the team can arrange phone or Zoom consultations with parents who would like the Safe Routes to School team to discuss rules of the road, biking safely in Palo Alto, and setting families up for success, sometimes like helping them with equipment choices, while accommodating shelter in place with their children and families. So, so we're very excited about all of those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. If any commissioners want to make comments, can you raise your hand, and after we hear from Nate, we can go to your comments. Thank you.
Okay, so this is Nate again. I think part of what I need to do today is just kind of introduce myself again. So again, I'm Nathan Baird. I am your new parking manager. It's been a very interesting couple months for me. I started on the first week of our shelter in place orders and have been working remotely for my entire time. So far, it's been interesting learning how to communicate with the team via entirely online channels. Chat and other sorts of Microsoft Teams functions I didn't know existed have all been much more useful than I would have thought they would have been just 3 or 4 months ago. But it really has been helpful to have chat tools, video channel tools. And so it's been interesting to get up to speed on in a new place in a new way as well. I've spent 10 some years in transportation roles at local cities. Previously, I worked at the city of Mountain View. Prior to that, I was in Southern California and worked at both LA and Long Beach in transportation roles. This is my first venture into parking, and it's been an exciting one. I've been poring over 5 to 10 years of Palo Alto documents related to parking. So no shortage of great ideas and great recommendations to help our systems improve. That said, we have a lot of work on parking in terms of getting ready for when the economy does get back, for when we do turn our parking regulations and enforcement back on. And so May 27th, your next meeting, I'll be bringing a fuller update on progress made on our parking working plan items, as well as some strategies and policies staff have been thinking through about how to streamline those and put those in place in a way that makes sense once the economy starts to come back online and once parking becomes again a very important resource for the city. So that's my introduction. I look forward to spending a little bit more time with you all next time.
Thank you both so much. Nate, just to reiterate how happy we are to have you on board and joining a wonderful team with Sylvia and Philip and the rest of the folks in transportation. I would suggest that people in Palo Alto are very interested in parking, and so you're going to have a lot of engagement once the COVID shelter in place lifts. So that'll be great to speak more with the community on that.
I suspect that we will have way more attendees next time.
More than likely. Sylvia, I wanted to say how much I appreciate that you are adapting so quickly and rolling out the program about the protected streets so quickly, and that you're getting wonderful feedback on it. I love that you're already measuring the feedback as close to rolling it out as possible. I think that's wonderful, that we should do more things like that. So just wanted to acknowledge that as well. So thank you. And looks like Vice Chair Rupavar has a comment.
Sylvia, I really have appreciated the street closures. The Ross Road one, I walk on it every single day with my daughter. I take her down with the stroller. I've seen a lot more people using it. It's been really cool. I had a question for you, and this is just, I think I have it right, but there's a sign that says closed to through traffic, so cars can't go through, but that means local people, Palo Alto people can still drive through, right? That's the point of it.
Yes. Yeah.
And we all know that, but outsiders don't. And that's how we.
Well, through traffic is a term. I think that might be a sign that is an official sign, in the traffic signage world. There are certain words you can use. We could have, I don't know if we could have put down something that said, local traffic only. I don't think you can say that. I actually don't think you can say that. But if you look at the website, which is our usual website, www.citypaloalto.org/shared streets, there's a listing of what is allowed and what's not allowed on the street. And we are allowing residents, we're allowing deliveries, we're allowing, mailman, we're allowing emergency services, all of those things that still have to happen. But we're really encouraging people who don't need to be there to use a different street. And at the very least, we're letting folks know you should expect something different happening on this street.
Yeah, it's actually been kind of fun. It's activated the street, and a lot of the locals go walk through it. And I don't know, it just takes away some of the loneliness during this time. But I walked on it. I live in Midtown. I walked it on Monday. So yeah, I saw that.
Excellent. Any other comments? Raise your hand. All right. Well, thank you for the staff reports.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right. I think it's great that the transportation team has been more active in our PTC meetings. So that's wonderful news as well. All right, so let's move on to the study session. And who is going to be driving that? Is that Jean or Rachel? Did you want to introduce it?
Yeah, I'll take a minute to introduce it. Thank you,
Okay,
Chair.
thanks.
So we're going to have a presentation this evening, a study session regarding objective standards. And as I was joking earlier, it's really kind of a planning nerds topic. So hopefully you are ready to think about the planning code and kind of really nuts and bolts of what it means to have a planning code and to administer it in Palo Alto. And we're really fortunate to have Jean Eisberg, who is the owner and principal of Lexington Planning, who has been working with our chief planning official, Amy French, and our current planning manager, Jody Gerhardt, to really lead this effort. And Jean brings a breadth of experience working with a variety of cities on policy projects, long-range planning projects, stakeholder projects, really from California and also even to Hawaii. She has just been really instrumental. Even you may recall if you were here when we did our resale preservation ordinance, she was part of bringing that forward. So she's familiar to Palo Alto, and I'm really hopeful, really glad that she's here tonight and working on this project, and you guys will get to meet her if you haven't already. And she also has her colleague, Chris Sensenig, and I'm sorry, Chris, if I didn't say your name properly. He's really been helping with design and architecture. And so as attachment A to the staff report, you saw an example of how a potential code could look. And he's responsible for helping to think about how to make it a little bit more visually communicative, and so that can provide some greater understanding for our applicants. So Jean is going to share her screen. She'll maybe introduce herself a little bit more, and we're going to go through her presentation. She will pause at a certain point in the presentation, and the chair may entertain questions from you all, and then she'll continue kind of into part two. Part one is kind of the context setting. What are we here to talk about? And kind of some of the bigger background, particularly around legislative changes that have occurred that are kind of precipitating this work happening. And then she'll get into those 5 recommendations that are part of the report. And so if you need to refresh yourself on those recommendations, she'll go over them. But on page 1 of the staff report towards the bottom, they're listed in that executive summary. Those are really the 5 things we really hope to get your feedback around. And while we think we're all fans of efficiency, this is our only agenda item tonight, so we can really hopefully dig into some of the nuts and bolts. And last thing I'll say is if you feel overwhelmed or confused by any of this, you are not alone. There's a lot here. It is like spaghetti entrenched, and kind of untangling it to see what you've got is part of why we're here in the study session format. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jean Eisberg.
You're muted, Jean.
You need to unmute yourself. There you go.
There we go. Thank you. So thank you, Rachel, for the intro, and good evening, Chair Templeton and members of the commission. I guess I am a planning nerd. I also like spaghetti, so I'm excited to be here to walk you through objective standards. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. So as Rachel said, I'm here tonight with Chris Sensenig, who will be available to answer questions when we get into any more design topics. And also, as Rachel said, we're sort of breaking this presentation into 2 pieces. First, to provide an overview of what this project really is, and then the context of why we're doing it, particularly the relationship to state housing law and to the city's policies. We'll take a break there after that 10-minute presentation to ask any clarifying questions among the commission, and then continue on to the key issues and recommendations section, where we're really looking for your feedback on 2 of those recommendations, number 1 and number 6. So I'll call those out when we get there. And then, as Rachel mentioned, we do have a framework for the design standards that we wanted to present to you. And as she mentioned, there's an attachment in the staff report that goes through one of the sections, and we don't want to go through the nitty-gritty of design tonight and talk about dimensions. There'll be a place for that later down the line, but the idea tonight is to frame the problem for you. And so this is not the last time you'll see this. but really just that this is just the beginning of your efforts here. So tonight we're just looking to present the project to you and get your preliminary feedback. We have already done a number of brainstorms with city staff, including front planning counter staff, on how they use the ordinance and the relationship between objective standards and the city's design criteria, which tend to be more subjective. We've met with the ARB twice now, and so that's how we've developed this objective standards framework, and I'll talk a little bit more about the ARB's feedback. And so here today, we're just checking in with you about where we are in the process, and we'll be back later this summer or fall with an ordinance for your consideration and your recommendation, hopefully, to the council. So the main problem here is that given changes in state law, the city's subjective design criteria, subjective regulations are going to be difficult to enforce for some multifamily and residential mixed-use projects. And so that's why we're looking at changes to make standards more objective. And so the outcomes or the objectives of this project, first and foremost, are to translate those context-based design criteria into objective standards. And in that way, to really capture the city's design intent as objective standards, because otherwise we may not be able to continue to enforce them for certain types of projects. So while we're doing that, we also want to identify new objective standards where content may be missing. Chris may mention this later, but one of the things that the code doesn't really get into right now are windows, for example. We're also looking to do some reorganization of the design standards. And you'll see this appear in the recommendations later on, but to make a more logical organization of the code, both for staff, for applicants, and for decision makers. And then the last two, adding graphics and an architectural review checklist to make sure that things don't get missed during the review process, and to just clarify and help illustrate what some of these standards are, which can sometimes more easily be shown in pictures. And then lastly, some of this, as we'll talk more about, some of this requirements for objective standards are coming from recent state law from SB35. And so part of this process, we've developed a draft application for SB35 to clarify what the city will require if an SB35 application comes in terms of submittal requirements. So what does this project apply to? So if you think about objective standards right now today in the comp plan, in Title 18, in the SOFA CAP plan, other adopted policies, a variety of objective standards that apply to all projects, whether they're commercial projects or residential projects, and those would continue in the future. So our focus for this project are amendments to the zoning ordinance to Title 18, and primarily for multifamily housing, which we define as 2 or more units, and for residential mixed-use projects. So if you had a residential over ground floor retail. And so we're really addressing the RM districts and the C districts, the downtown CD district, CNCS, so you can think about California Avenue, San Antonio, El Camino Real. Now, what is an objective standard? The quote up top on this slide is from state law. These are standards that involve no personal or subjective judgment. They're uniformly verifiable, and they're known prior to submittal. So one simple example here is just a front setback. A front setback is defined in the zoning ordinance, 10 feet. We all can understand what that means. So front setback shall be a minimum of 10 feet. That we consider an objective standard. On the other hand, what are subjective criteria, subjective standards? 2 examples here, one from the performance standards in the city's code. Parking should be broken up into smaller groups of spaces to avoid large expanses of parking. There's different ways that we can interpret this. How many spaces constitutes a smaller group of spaces? What constitutes a larger expanse of parking? That's a debatable criteria. Likewise, many of the context-based design criteria in the code are also subjective. So here, scale and massing should be compatible with the existing pattern of buildings. That's not a clear measurable criteria and is subject to interpretation, so we consider it subjective. So this is showing how the current regulatory framework is in the city. So the city regulates in Title 18 uses, regulates development standards, parking, the retail protection ordinance. many of those sections of the code are objective. However, other sections of the code and other ways that we regulate development are subjective. The conditions of approval, for example, may include both some objective criteria that emanate from the code, but also criteria that are applied, say, by the ARB during the review and approval process. Now, those, again, are, if we think back to that legislative definition, those are not knowable prior to application. On the bottom 3 rows there, the context-based criteria, as I mentioned, are mostly subjective. Certainly legislative actions are discretionary actions when you're applying an overlay or changing the zoning, discretionary actions by the PTC and council. And then lastly, ARB findings are likewise subjective criteria. So what we're looking to do here is to establish standards that implement the intent of these existing subjective criteria. So taking the ARB findings, taking the context-based design criteria, and making them objective. That doesn't mean that those criteria, that the ARB findings go away. Those would still be used, and we'll talk a little bit more about which projects those could apply to. And in a way, they can continue to apply to all projects that go towards the ARB. It's just in the way that they can be applied to a project. So the next piece of this first part of the presentation is the policy context. So first, the Housing Accountability Act. This is a state law that's been on the books for almost 40 years, but it's starting to be invoked more and more by developers. You may have heard about cities getting sued on the Housing Accountability Act. And some of the recent state laws over the last couple of years have continued to strengthen the Housing Accountability Act in an effort to facilitate housing development and specifically affordable housing development. So what the HAA says is that when a project complies with objective standards, a city cannot deny it, reduce its density, or make it infeasible unless the project would have a specific adverse impact, which is narrowly defined in state law. Things like environmental issues, historic resources. So this act applies to all housing and development projects, which the city interprets to mean 2 or more residential units. So the HAA does not apply to single-family residential. Additionally, a project must be at least 2/3 residential. So where it applies to mixed use, it would need to be at least, let's say, ground floor retail and 2 stories of residential above. So some examples of how this might apply in Palo Alto. On the left of the screen, a multifamily residential building in an RM district that complies with all objective standards, that would be an HAA compliant project. Likewise, a mixed use project that's 2/3 residential in downtown, or a state density bonus law project, which gets waivers and concessions to reduce, say, parking or increase the height limit, would also be covered by the Housing Accountability Act. And then lastly, an SB35 streamlining project would also typically be covered by the HAA. Where it doesn't apply on the right-hand side here, say you had 1 story of residential over ground floor retail, well, that's less than 2/3 housing, and so the HAA wouldn't apply. Likewise, projects seeking rezoning and concurrent architectural review the HAA would not apply. That's a discretionary and legislative action. And then the housing incentive program, again, that requires discretionary review. Likewise, a project requesting a reduction in parking spaces. So they're just a few examples of the HAA. The SB35 project streamlining, some of you may be familiar with this, went into effect last January 2019. And this allows projects that are at least 2/3 residential and projects which, in the case of Palo Alto, have at least 50% of their units allocated for low-income households, and projects that have consistent zoning and are consistent with all objective standards, allows certain streamlining provisions. And I do want to point out that right now the city of Palo Alto is subject to the 50% threshold that is renewed or updated by HCD, the Housing Community Development Department for the state, annually based on the city's progress towards the RHNA. So right now that's where Palo Alto is at. We don't know where Palo Alto could end up in the next couple of years, but right now that means that there probably aren't too many projects that are going to come in as SB35 projects. But what those projects get to do is they're subject to ministerial approval, a shortened review period, no CEQA review is required, and no discretionary review is required. And so some examples of what that looks like. What could happen is in Palo Alto is a nonprofit housing developer could propose 100% affordable project. They could combine that with a state density bonus law project, say to get a height waiver or a parking waiver, and that could be an SB35 project. The less likely scenario right now, the second bullet, would be that market rate developer teaming with an affordable housing provider, doing a 50% affordable, 50% market rate project with at least 2/3 residential. But again, the point here is that these projects have to comply with objective standards, so understanding what those are is an important consideration. The next key housing law is something that went into effect in January, SB330. Two important elements here. First, this prohibits jurisdictions from imposing new subjective design standards established after January 1st of this year. That does mean that existing subjective criteria can continue to be applied, but new standards must be objective. And then second, it prohibits jurisdictions from enacting policies that would change current zoning and general plan designations where housing is an allowable use to lessen the intensity of housing. And so what that means is that, one, a city cannot downzone a district unless they showed that a different area was upzoned or sort of accounted for those potential loss of residential units somewhere else. For our purposes, what this is getting at is that we couldn't make the development standards so strict that we were eliminating the possibility for lessening the intensity of housing in a certain location without accounting for increasing the intensity of housing in another location. So we're almost done with state law, and this is maybe the good side of things, is that this project is funded by Senate Bill 2, which is seeking to provide local governments with assistance to both streamline housing approvals, facilitate housing, specifically low-income housing, and facilitate housing production. So how does this all relate to the city's efforts? We have a number of objective standards, and we have housing policies in the comp plan, in the housing element, and in the housing work plan that the council adopted a couple of years ago. That housing work plan had specific action items to strengthen the city's objective standards and sort of foresaw some of the changes that we've continued to see this year in terms of SB 330. But as you can tell from the state laws that I went through, the legislature is relying more on projects' compliance with these objective standards to facilitate review and approval. And so we might continue to see the importance of objective standards over time. I did want to mention the zoning update that went into effect about a year ago, made a number of changes to help facilitate housing production. This project is really aiming to streamline the housing review and approval process, a little bit different. But one thing that zoning update did last year was eliminate site and design review. So whereas 2 years ago, if a housing project with fewer than 10 units were proposed in the city, that would only require review by city staff and the ARB. Projects with 10 or more units would go to the PTC and the council, regardless of whether this Housing Accountability Act applied or not. The changes to the zoning ordinance last year changed that review process. So the way it is now, city staff is reviewing all projects, but the PTC and the council are only reviewing multifamily housing projects that are requesting a rezoning or application of a affordable housing overlay or workforce housing overlay. The ARB continues to see most projects, most multifamily projects, regardless of the number of units. And then in the case of SB35 projects, city staff would be reviewing those at a ministerial level. So when we think about those various project types, those various multifamily and 2/3 residential mixed-use project types, objective standards apply across the board. All of those projects will be ensuring that the project meets objective standards. But the way that the city can apply its subjective criteria are different depending on the project type. So for SB35 projects, those subjective criteria really don't apply at all. For a Housing Accountability Act project, it's a little bit more complicated, and that's this asterisk here. So remembering what that HAA law tells us, a city cannot just approve a project, reduce its density, or otherwise make it infeasible.
Jean, can I stop you for 1 second? And I don't know
Yeah,
if you
I'm
just might
lost my
think
feed.
You're maybe stuck. Maybe try turning off your video and then turning it back on and share the screen again.
Okay, my Zoom seems to be restarting. So if
Okay.
you can give me a minute. It was such an exciting slide too.
I know, it's the culmination of all the previous slides.
Yeah, I'm gonna restart here.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay, we're reconnecting. Bear with me. Okay, are you able to see my screen now? Okay,
Yes,
great.
we do see it.
Okay, so I was at the second row here. So a little more complicated for those Housing Accountability Act projects. For example, the ARB could still talk about those findings. They could talk about the design criteria, but they cannot use them at this asterisk, cannot use them to disapprove a project, reduce its density, or make the project infeasible. For these other types of projects, the ARB would be using their findings, would be using design guidelines to comment on projects and potentially recommend changes to projects. So as a segue, and before we just break here for a minute, I wanted to talk about the feedback that we got from the Architecture Review Board when we met with them in February. And so first, most board members were concerned that design standards would be overly prescriptive and would restrict the influence of character or context on enabling high quality design. So there was just this overall sense of concern about being too prescriptive. They did want to regulate and address transitions between height and uses, which right now is captured in the context-based design criteria in terms of compatibility guidelines. However, they recognize that this is really challenging to create a one-size-fits-all standard for different types of uses and locations. Third, and this is one of the tensions that maybe some of you are feeling too, some board members were concerned about the concept of creating strict standards. We talked about things like 0 shadows being allowed to be cast or specific types of materials that were allowed to be used. But allowing exceptions if an applicant agrees to go through architecture review, so sort of as a way out. Other board members were concerned that this would be too conservative and restrict housing development altogether. Still, other board members supported more flexible options, such as a menu of choices, which you'll see we'll talk more about in the second half of the presentation. And then lastly, there was a desire to allow for some flexibility for affordable housing, particularly around things like regulations for materials. If we end up regulating materials, making sure that the requirements don't get too expensive. And then lastly, there was a fair amount of agreement about basic good design principles that could apply to all types of projects. For example, the length of a facade as one example. So I wanted to pause there and ask the chair if you'd like to ask any questions.
Thank you. So just to remind folks that if you need to use the raise hand function, you can access that by clicking on the participants icon that has people and the number beside it. And then there's a raise hand button there. And if you're dialing in by phone, I believe it's *9 will cause you to raise your hand. So if you have any questions for Jean about the presentation so far. So let's give folks a moment to chime in if they have questions. All right, seeing none, we will move on. Thank you very much. It's obviously a sign of a very good, clear, well-organized presentation. So thank you, Jean.
Okay, great. So as we're getting into the next section, I do want to say that the legislature is not requiring that we adopt objective standards, but that, again, for certain types of projects, they can't necessarily be enforced. And so if we did nothing, that would be okay. It's just that we don't have the opportunity to continue the intent and the desire for design standards that right now are captured by ARB findings. So I'm going to go through the 6 recommendations that are mentioned in the staff report. Some of them may sound sort of perfunctory. I think they are a little bit more directed at staff and applicants, but I do want to focus your attention a little bit more on the first recommendation and the 6th recommendation. So I'll remind you when we get to the last one. But the first one is really at the heart of the project here, which is revising the context-based design criteria as objective standards. As I mentioned with the ARB, we had this little tension between whether to be more conservative or more flexible. And so this is where we've landed in terms of our recommendation after discussions with ARB and staff. So the way it is now, many of the design criteria are subjective. So bullet 1, where guidelines can be easily transformed into objective standards by adding a dimension or a measurement, then we would use that approach. Bullet number 2, many guidelines just don't lend themselves to that unit of measurement. I mentioned compatibility, garage context, things like that. So instead, we could develop a number of options for standards. You can see at the right-hand side of the page a menu of options for active ground floor residential. Or instead of meeting the standard, if for some reason the developer or the architect didn't want to meet that standard, it didn't make sense for that project, they can instead meet the guideline, the intent statement, and that would be as determined by the ARB. And so in that way, the applicant is choosing to go through that discretionary review for that certain design topic. So the idea here is to aim to create reasonable standards, not conservative, not overly prescriptive. So recommendation number 2 is to streamline design standards. So right now, many of the design criteria are repeated as many as 4 times across the code in different zoning districts. So we recommend removing those redundancies, in part by reorganizing the design criteria into its own standalone section, which happens to be recommended as 18.24. The way we're thinking about this is that most of those design standards would apply to multifamily and mixed-use residential projects across the board, but that there may be some additional standards for certain types of uses, particularly where you have 100% residential versus ground floor retail, and certain locations. For example, El Camino Real has a standard for a 12-foot sidewalk. And then recommendation number 3, if you think about the code, there are also a number of development regulations in other sections of the code. Performance criteria in 18.23, general standards in 18.40 that address landscaping, open space, refuse storage, things that are design related, but they're sort of scattered in different parts of the code. And so something that we talked about with staff is that there are things that sometimes easily get missed or just don't quite make sense in that section. So this is going to relate to the next recommendation, but here we're recommending that we make sure that all of those standards are objective so that they can be used in a review of an SB35 or HA application, and then potentially relocating those standards in a way that they're easier to find. For example, in the performance standards chapter, there is a subsection about parking design. And so one thing that we reviewed with staff is that may be more appropriately located in the parking facility design section of the code. So in this way, we're recommending eliminating 18.23 performance standards and moving those regulations into different sections of the code where they make sense. So again, this is seeking to reduce redundancies, inconsistencies, and lack of clarity to help staff and applicants through the application process. The fifth recommendation is fairly simple, but just the idea of using more graphics to illustrate standards. Right now, the city does use graphics outside of the code for single-family homes in a user's guide that frontline staff use at the counter. There are graphics in the context-based design criteria. These graphics could be part of the code, or they could be a standalone section outside of the code, but just to help both applicants understand what's meant by a standard and help staff in the interpretation. So the last recommendation, number 6, is also something that we're looking for your feedback on. This is kind of a new idea, but rethinking legislative actions into objective criteria. So the way the code is now, there are a couple different overlay districts, like the workforce housing overlay, the affordable housing overlay, that have criteria for when they can apply for above moderate income housing in the case of workforce housing, or moderate income housing in the case of affordable housing. But they require this legislative action. They require review by the TCC and the City Council prior to architectural review. And so one thing that we can consider is, instead of making these legislative actions, to essentially make them by right, that projects that meet these eligibility criteria could automatically be eligible for the reduction in, or the more flexible development standards. And so in this way, it's a little bit similar to the housing incentive program that was codified last year, in terms of making that link clear between when a project can be eligible for certain more flexible standards. So last section of the presentation, I mentioned we provided an example section in the staff report for the design standards subchapter. And I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of dimensions and specific standards. We are going to be working with the ARB and an ARB subcommittee on those specifics, but I did want to present it here so you can see the direction that we're headed and provide any feedback on that. But taking the big picture here in terms of how this chapter may be organized, and this is Chris's work, thinking about starting with the site design, the circulation, the access, the site planning, and then looking at the continuum of how we design a site. So after that big picture look, looking at the massing and scale, the modulation of a building, and then finally the facade articulation and architectural details. And so we go from that large urban scale to the fine grained scale in how this chapter may be organized. Within those bigger topics, you can see that the sections on the right-hand side of the table that we're proposing for how to organize this chapter. And within each topic, we would have an intent statement that emanates from the ARB findings, from the existing design criteria, and then you essentially have two paths for how to meet the objective standard or that intent statement. So one, you can choose to meet the objective standard, which sometimes could mean a dimension standard, other times may mean this menu of options where you're choosing between 1, 2, or 3 options, or if for whatever reason the developer, the architect doesn't want to meet that specific standard, you're instead choosing to go through the ARB review, where the ARB determines whether you've met the intent of that design topic. So the example in your packet is a section on facade design. And here you have an example of an intent statement. This, again, is coming from some of the language of the existing context-based design criteria. And then you have one example of a standard, and in this case, it's a menu of options. So in the middle of the page here, current context-based design criteria, this particular criteria is relating to a building having a base, body, roof, a base, middle, and a top. And so this idea is this menu of options where a developer would choose from one variation in building modulation to meet the intent of the facade design intent statement that I showed on the previous page. So you could choose to make a horizontal shift, an upper floor step back, or a ground floor step back. And the idea is that these, you're only selecting one, and that these are objective standards. So next steps in the process, just repeating this graphic that I showed up front. After tonight's meeting and based on your feedback, we'll be going to work with the ARB and the ARB subcommittee on reviewing the complete draft standards and on reviewing a preliminary draft ordinance. And then we will be coming back to you probably this fall with a draft ordinance. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the structure of how the rest of the conversation will go is that commissioners who have technical questions should raise their hands. I will acknowledge them in order, and then we will check and see if we have any public comment, and then we will get into the discussion. And so does anyone have any technical questions or questions around the presentation material itself? All right, I see three, Commissioner Alchek, Lowing, and Hechtman. So Commissioner Alchek.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to save, I meant to uncheck that. I'm going to save my question for staff after, I guess, public comment. It's not, I don't know if it qualifies as a technical question, so I'll just wait.
Okay. All right, thanks. Commissioner Lowing.
Yeah, my first question is, could you define what technical is in the context of this discussion?
So any clarifications of the material presented versus opining? Okay.
In that case, I want to start with page 1, because you said something about 2/3 of the way through your presentation that I didn't think sort of squared. The whole idea here is to come up with objective standards, and you want our input on it. And it says they're needed to fulfill requirements under Senate Bill SB2, et cetera. And in your presentation, you say it's okay if we do nothing. So I didn't quite understand that. So if you could start there, and I have a couple after that.
Sure. So to clarify, let's say an SB35 project came through the door, and to review that project's only required to meet objective standards. If a city had no objective standards, then it wouldn't need to meet any of them. So if that project comes in the door today, it's required to meet all the objective standards that are currently on the books. So you can think about setbacks, height, FAR, residential density. So those could continue to be addressed going forward. However, that project would not be required to meet the design criteria. It would not need to be evaluated according to the ARB findings. And so the thing that gets lost is if the city's design priorities essentially could get lost if we don't adopt objective standards that specifically around design that are intended to translate those subjective criteria into objective standards. I hope that helps clarify.
Yes, it does. A couple other questions I think are qualified in this section. Under the SB35 with 50% affordable, is there a codified definition of what affordable is there?
Yes, those are low-income units. So that's yeah, at least low. So it could be low or very low, but at least low income.
Okay, but those come out to be certain numbers, right? In terms of current median income?
That's right. I don't want to get this wrong. Low income, it's either 60 or 80% of AMI. I'm not remembering off the top of my head.
Okay, and then the second paragraph there, you're defining essentially the penalties if they come back and say we haven't made a good enough progress on reading numbers, correct?
That's right. So if a city either does not submit its annual report of how it's doing towards its RENA, or it doesn't meet certain aspects of its RENA on a year-to-year basis, so then it could get pushed into the 10% category, in which case a developer would only need to provide 10% low-income units in order to have an eligible SB35 project, in addition to all of the other SB35 eligibility criteria.
Okay. think that's all that would qualify under this section.
Thank you. Commissioner Heckman.
Thank you. This is really a process question. So attached to the staff report is attachment A. There's a kind of a sample of objectifying some of the subjective standards into and quantifying various things. And I think I understood you to say that one of the next steps of this process is going to be working with either ARB or a subcommittee of ARB to I think come up with those quantifications. So how many feet of setback, for a particular situation of massing. And so my question is that process going to happen before this comes back to the PTC, so that when it comes back to the PTC, we'll see that ARB work?
Yes, that was our thinking.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, Commissioner Heckman, and Jody Gerhardt is here if you have other questions for the ARB. She does run our current planning and our ARB. They are going to have a subcommittee that will be focusing, kind of really rolling up their sleeves or sharpen their pencils, I'm not sure, maybe getting out some rulers to help with that process.
All right, Vice Chair Ruth Bavar, followed by Commissioner Suma.
So that slide that you had where you said it's topic based, a developer can choose to go objective design criteria or subjective. The intent statement. So that is by topic. So for example, I just want to make sure I understand this. Someone can come say, okay, windows, I don't want to meet fenestration. I don't want to meet objective standards. I'm just going to go to ARB for that. But then for like setback on my front entryway, I'm going to meet objective standard. Does it go piecemeal like that? Or does it come all in one? And then once you go subjective, the whole project is subjective with the ARB? I'm just a little bit confused.
That's a great question. And Albert may want to weigh in too, but my understanding of two different parts of the question, how it relates to the Housing Accountability Act and how it relates procedurally. So let's say, most likely an SB35 project is not going to want to get into the world of intent statements because it takes them out of ministerial approval. So if they went this route, in effect, they wouldn't be meeting the objective standard. And so they really couldn't do that. They couldn't meet the intent statement. They would always have to meet the objective standard. Let's say a project was otherwise compliant with the Housing Accountability Act. If on that one topic of facade design, they didn't or couldn't meet that objective standard, and they moved into the world of intent statement, they'd already be at the ARB. For that particular topic, under that, essentially the ARB's discretionary aspect of their review would only pertain to that specific topic. However, they're at the ARB, and in practice, the ARB would be reviewing the entire, it sort of opens up the entire project. But to your point, in terms of the Housing Accountability Act, it really isolates them on that specific topic.
Got it. Thank you.
So I guess I'll just weigh in with, I think it's up to us whether we want to limit it just to the specific topic, or if we want to say, if you're not able to comply with all of the objective criteria, then you're thrown into your entire project can be thrown into the subjective realm. Yeah, so.
All right, thank you.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just to follow up. So when you say up to us, is it going to be something that's going to be written into the code, or is it going to be just project by project basis and the ARB decides whether to open up the whole thing or not? How does that work?
So I think we would want to write it into the code the way that we want to structure our process. I was just speaking to, the way that the Housing Accountability Act is written, it prescribes a local jurisdiction's authority for these projects that meet applicable objective criteria. But if a project, even if it's just one of those objective criteria, if it doesn't meet all the objective criteria, then we don't fall under, the realm of the Housing Accountability Act anymore.
Thank you.
Chris, did you want to weigh in on this question as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, yes, it is up to the city to decide the review process once you get into the subjective. And in different cities, we've dealt with this in different ways. One is that the whole project goes to subjective review, but we've also kind of quantified how many objective standards that, like, if you're only missing 2 of them, then maybe the ARB only reviews those 2. But if you're missing 3 or more, then the whole project becomes a subjective review. So there's different gradients that a city can work in.
Thank you. Is there anything else, Vice Chair?
No, thank you. That was helpful clarification.
All right. Commissioner Suma.
I'll wait till later. Thanks.
Okay, and I've seen some interest in the questions from the commissioners, so I just want to throw this out there as a possibility. You heard that the ARB has formed a subcommittee to look into this and dig in a little bit more detail than they can at our regular meetings. So if you have an interest in forming a subcommittee, we should discuss that. And I'm trying to recall the rules around if it has to be agendized and things like that. So Rachel or Albert, if you want to speak up about the process there, but I also wanted to throw that out that we might want to consider that for PTC as well.
Yes, I believe, Chair, that we would agendize that for our next meeting if that was something that we had, interest from people actually dedicating time to that.
Excellent. So thanks for clarifying. And when we come back around to our discussion portion, if you are interested, please speak up. So at this time, we are going to open the floor for public comments. Please dial in per the instructions on the agenda if you're listening from home on
Before you do
cable.
that, can I,
Sure.
I've had my hand raised. I've had my hand raised.
Oh, I see it now. I'm so sorry, Commissioner Riggs. Please go forward.
Yeah, you see my face too. I actually think this will work well as it, and I actually don't understand the mechanics for this either, Rachel, so I'll just be candid and I'm throwing this out there as an idea. But I actually I'm not a big fan of subcommittees, but I actually think a joint subcommittee would be really effective in this case. And so, and having some cross-pollination between ARB and PTC would be really fertile. So I'm going to throw that out there as an idea. I don't understand the mechanics of it. And, but I think it would be really effective from a workflow standpoint in terms of kind of responding as well as edifying the great stuff that Jean presented, and kudos to you, Jean. Really, really good presentation.
I completely agree, Commissioner Riggs. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, so I don't see any folks dialed in. Ben, are you seeing anyone?
We currently don't have any public comment at this time, so I believe we can proceed with the agenda.
All right, so then we will close public comment and now we can do our discussion. So we'll go in order of hands raised as I see them. So please feel free to use that feature again. And if you have spoken and then have additional questions, it's fine to raise your hand again. We can do a couple of rounds as this is a bit of a meaty topic. So who would like to go first? All right, Commissioner Suma.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It was a very informative staff report, so thanks everybody. And I do think it's really good that we're doing this. I think that retaining some of the values from the subjective review as objective standards is a really important thing to do, and probably kind of a hard thing to do in some cases. And I was a little concerned as I was reading the staff report before the presentation that we might be getting a little ahead of ourselves there's so much unpredictability in the future and whether housing or office is, whether there'll be a surplus. I mean, it is kind of crazy right now. So that's just one idea. Do you want to go down, Chair, the recommendations one by one, or just the two that Ms. Eisenberg is most?
I'm open to either way. I was anticipating that there might be some general comments first, but we definitely should at some point address the point. So if you want to,
okay, so I'll just
let's do one pass on general, and then we'll go through one by one. How does that sound?
Whatever you think. So I'm a little concerned about when we use the dimensioned standards along with the set of menus. I'm a little concerned about, and this is really an architectural concern, but it's a planner's concern too, that we're going to end up with a lot of buildings that look a lot alike. So I'm worried about losing sort of a sense of individuality. And I'm a little bit worried at the same time about standardizing across different zones and neighborhoods, that we might end up with losing a little bit of neighborhood uniqueness. So, and I see 2, 3, and 4 of the recommendations as being more about organizing the code than policy questions. Is that the right way to think about it?
Commissioner Suma, that is an accurate assessment of those recommendations.
Okay, then I think those are my concerns. Oh, and I have a question, and it's kind of a funny question, but I was wondering if planners ever consider evaluating buildings by volume. And very infrequently, but sometimes it does come up that the FAR, because of the way FAR in certain cases is counted, it doesn't really capture the size of the building as people experience it from outside, not people using the building. And I was wondering if that was ever a standard way for in certain situations of looking at building impact.
Maybe I'll ask if Chris might address that in terms of, have other cities addressed kind of volume as a standard and maybe created different standards based on the building's volume? Is this something you've seen?
I mean, that is basically what is commonly known as a form code, which is really outlining the overall mass of the building from a dimensional standpoint. You get this many feet in this direction, this many feet of depth, and you're really creating its form and regulating that way. I would say kind of the standard, at least across the Bay Area, is similar to what Palo Alto has done, where you have a set of design guidelines that are form-based, but then there's a traditional zoning code kind of underlaying it that regulates FAR and height and other use things.
Okay, thank you. Those are my general comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I see Commissioner Alczak, followed Commissioner Riggs. Commissioner Alczak?
Yeah, okay, first question for Mr. Sensenig. You're as an outside sort of consultant, are you working with any other jurisdictions on something similar to this?
Yes. I am currently writing, they call it Clear and Objective up in Oregon. So I'm doing a zoning code in the city of Eugene right now. Earlier this year, completed a downtown zoning code for Beaverton, Oregon. And we're currently working on
a specific plan in Sunnyvale and a master plan in Mountain View. So I also have an architecture background, I should say. And actually, over 10 years ago, I worked on the context-based design criteria for the city of Palo Alto that we're currently rewriting. So I've worked on a lot of both objective and design guidelines kind of throughout the Bay Area.
Okay, that's awesome. This, I guess, question goes to anyone who can answer it, which is just that, you know, I'd be very interested to sort of hear the discussions at the ARB level. You know, one thing that I think sets us apart from some of our neighbors is that our planning commission doesn't really participate in sort of a subjective review of projects. And, you know, to be quite frank, we don't even really have that much experience sort of crossing the line or the new line in the past, because often when we have a project that's up for review, we're very limited in our discussion because of the way that Palo Alto sort of bifurcates the decision-making process with respect to projects like this. And so I'd just be curious if staff could identify and maybe in the abstract, what code sections that would be subject to some modification that are actually specifically relevant to our review. And not because I'm suggesting I'm not suggesting that this changes in any way the discussion tonight, but we don't participate in aesthetics, and we don't really make decisions based on whether something is cohesive with its, you know, neighboring sites. We stay far away from that in our decision-making process. So just for the purposes of sort of understanding how this will impact our process, are there any sections that you imagine would be amended that would actually change what we currently do as a planning commission when projects like this come before us that might at the ARB level need to be addressed differently? But that's sort of, I'm curious to.
So that's a great question, Commissioner Alchek, and I'll ask Jody Gerhart if she will be ready to weigh in a little bit on that, and Jean may also have some comments. I think one of the kind of important reasons that the ARB was looking forward to the PTC discussing this item and providing some feedback is that while they, to your point, really do deal with the subjective guidelines and are kind of, this would definitely change their work and their process to a great deal. They wanted to have the PTC to really wrestle with and kind of opine on some of these policy questions of kind of what is the direction that we should go as a city, and how should the ARB really be thinking about its work. To use the example that Jean created, you know, do we want a menu of options, or, you know, do we want to use a very extreme example, say everything must be brick and glass, and if you use any other materials, you know, you've got to go through the subjective review. So Jody, perhaps you can weigh in a little bit more on what the ARB was looking for, and then also if there are, whether it's Jody or Jean, what the PTC's role, how their role would change, you know, if the objective standards are adopted.
Thank you, Rachel. I think that was a good summary. I think the ARB are mostly made up of professional architects, and they feel like it's their, excuse me, their job to implement the city's code. Whereas for the PTC, you know, you're helping to create that code that the ARB would implement. And we're definitely putting together the ARB subcommittee, though, because they do have that technical expertise to get down into the details to help us with that. But we do also want a sense from the PTC, just generally an overview of what you're looking for, what different neighborhoods have a different look and feel. And so is there anything that you really want to retain? Commissioner Sumo was talking about retaining that neighborhood uniqueness. So are there things like that that we need to be aware of and we can make sure and incorporate?
So I guess my follow-up question would be that I think I would find it exceptionally helpful if staff or outside, consultants provided some materials representing the way other jurisdictions are approaching this. And the reason why is, I can't really take my land use attorney hat off, which I'm approaching this from the sort of perspective of it's a liability that we have so many subjective standards in our review process because it allows cities to potentially restrict developments for what would otherwise be considered improper reasons, right? That there's an element of bias involved in the process if the standards are too subjective. And so what we're really talking about here is tying the hands of the ARBs to some extent, whether it's here are your options, right? Here's the list of options, or here are with their feedback, I'm trying to understand what criteria, would in some regard tie their hands. And so I think that's an interesting role for us, because I think all of us understand the quote unquote liability, right? The concerns and the sort of the reasoning behind this new push. But at the same time, no one cares if, no one's asked us if we like the color of the buildings, and we weren't sort of put in place to sort of make those conclusions. And I think it would be a lot easier for me to understand how to go about some of these changes. Number one, if I had some like real world examples, and number two, actually, if there was an opportunity to sit down with ARB members or representatives of the ARB, and for them to sort of express to us where they really often feel like they're just standing on very shaky ground, right? Like they're reviewing an item under this quote unquote criteria, but they never feel strongly that the case could be made either way. But what are those examples where you could really go either way on these conditions? And so we need to rein those in, because that allows too much subjective bias in the process. So I just want to throw that out there, that if there's an opportunity to review material from other jurisdictions, I think that would be very helpful, because I think there's probably like really good red flag examples. Like anytime they talk about X, this is just, and maybe there's I'm sure there's some case law. Case law is really knocked out. This, whenever we talk about this, it's garbage, right? So that would be a good sort of a summary of some of those cases. And then also if the ARB could tell us themselves where they often feel like they don't have, they have a very hard time making a strong case either way, that would be helpful.
Terry, I'm wondering if I can jump in before there is a response to that.
Okay, it looks like Jody
I
also
didn't
wanted
sense
to
a question
respond.
there, but if that's not a question embedded in what Mr. Alchek said, can I jump in there as the person with their hand up next?
Hold on just a second. Jody, looked like you were about ready to respond. Did you wanted to respond before Billy goes, or do you want to wait?
Just quickly, the ARB does have an annual report that they sent to the council. I want to say somewhat recently, but it's probably been a good couple months. So I can find that and send that to everyone, because that did have, these stumbling blocks that you were talking about, that was discussed in their annual report.
Thank you, Jody. Commissioner Riggs.
I'm double mute myself just to make sure there's no kid background noise. So I think the reason why I wanted to jump in is because Commissioner Alchuk, Mike, you were hitting on some of the things that I think are some of the embedded assumptions here. So first off, I just want conditions. This is great work, and our consulting team actually just done amazing work here. My general, these are general, and I don't have specific comments. So this is probably the last time you hear from me tonight. But I think some of the tension here, and so I'm going to break this up into two pieces. The second thing I have to say is more for staff than for the group. But I think the problem here is that we're in this middle ground between having a form-based code and having these objective standards. And I think that is actually what we're talking about here, the tension between the two. I've talked about maybe moving to a form-based code on the dais before, and I think that actually maybe what we should be asking is whether or not we need to consider a full palette that actually is responsive to the different neighborhoods. And I guess turning that into a question is that, as a first step, this is great, but are we going to consider just moving to a form-based code and having responsive design guidelines and form-based guidelines that actually, for example, in the downtown respond to historic standards, and South Palo Alto respond to the Eichler design guidelines? I think these are questions where even taking this a step further, I think would help both Commission and ARB be a little more objective across the board. And so this is where I think we're in this, in my opinion, we're in this middle ground between nudging towards a form-based code, but not actually accepting that we have a form-based code. I think that's my reservation, despite my excitement about what we're doing now. So that's a question. Signpost that. The other thing is really more of a comment, which is I think this is the right step. I'm really excited by making more objective standards. I think we should do more. My opinion is that we should move to a full-on form-based code. That's my opinion. But I also think this is not that we should actually move to more objective and standardized conditions as well. And that's something I brought up on the dais before as well. And this is more for staff than anything, is that I'd like to consider revisiting, and if this is can be a part of this consultant's work or another consultant, revisiting standardizing conditions as well on projects, because I think that would make our throughput much more efficient as well. The more we can standardize and make clear for applicants, here are standard conditions, here are standard guidelines, that's only going to improve our process. So those are my two comments.
Thank you, Commissioner Riggs. I may be thinking of a different conversation, but I do believe that Jean and Chris, we at one point did speak about, I think perhaps comes to my mind is Chris's work in Oregon, that some cities maybe started at one place where we are currently and did extend that to having maybe more and more objective standards. Obviously, again, I think that is a policy choice for both the PTC, maybe to recommend to council, and for council to really uptake if that was the desire. This could be seen as a step in that direction, or again, can be really just preparing us to be ready in case we have SB35 or Housing Accountability Act projects, that we have a path for those projects to retain the things that are really important in Palo Alto. So I don't know, Chris or Jean, if you can speak to how you've seen that work in other cities, maybe as going towards form-based code and what that would look like in Palo Alto. And then of course, Jody or Amy, if you do have any comments regarding that, you're free to make them also. If you don't, that's fine too.
Yeah, I think I can speak to some of it. I think in a certain way, this creating objective standards out of the context-based design criteria will get you most of the way to this quote form code. In a way, I don't think there's very, very few cities that have ever really implemented a strict form code because they don't find them particularly practical on an overall basis. Because people want to regulate use and other things. But to speak to both commissioners' kind of questions about like where does what we're doing have to do with like the policy questions.
Chris, I think you're muted.
Vin, can you unmute him?
Spacebar technique. My spacebar gave out. Okay, I'm not sure where I ended, but for like providing input on policy, I think a big important part of that is that the Architecture Review Board's findings are actually very broad. And then the context-based design criteria provided much more detail. And then the restructuring of this is trying to have very clear intent statements for each topic. And these intent statements are kind of expanding the Architecture Review Board's findings with more language that like is probably more like really expanding policy in a way. And then, it's the objective standards are, codifying those intent statements. And I think that's, one place where, this commission's review will be kind of critical. Jean, I'll let Jean see if I'm making sense here, or Jody. Did we lose Jean?
Jean is still muted.
Okay.
I don't know that I have much. Oh, there you go. Go ahead, Jean.
There we go. Oh, I think that's right on. I mean, I would describe Palo Alto's code as a hybrid code. You are regulating both form and use. And we see a lot of cities doing kind of the similar thing. And so you've got these very subjective, open-ended ARB findings, which gives them a lot of discretion where that path is available to them with certain types of projects. And then you have these development regulations, which are requirements. And so that's what we're trying to continue to modulate.
And all we're suggesting is that some of the points of tension are really embedded in that because we are in that intermediary space. And that's really, that's the whole point of what I was saying, is that a lot of the questions are because of that.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, in a way though, that's a great thing about Palo Alto, is that you guys have allowed a lot of diversity in architecture. And I mean, I think that's one of the hard things with these objective standards. And especially when, like, I mean, this might not be what you're intending in your statement of pushing towards a form code, but as far as like creating objective standards, even in a form code framework, like you almost need to over prescribe the design to make it objective. And, that's where this fine balance of how do you create a good set of objective standards that also allows flexibility. Now there's always, the applicant can always just choose to go the discretionary path, right? But you can't deny a project, like if it's meeting all the objective standards.
All right, thank you. Looks like we're having a good discussion. Commissioner Lowing is next.
Okay, yeah, it was a very good discussion. I really appreciated the comments by both Commissioner Alchuk and Commissioner Riggs. I think the discussion of this being somewhat in tension, TENSION, is exactly the point. And I think even the ARB and what they sent back to us in item number 2, when they talked about a conservative versus a flexible approach, where they couldn't agree on what's best, at least in terms of giving us guidance, is right on point for what we're discussing. And a number of you, both staff and commissioners, have been talking about, does one size fit all? Or, you know, what about look and feel in a neighborhood? So I think we're right on the critical point of this, and we shouldn't, on the one hand, be having bias in decisions to turn down housing. And on the other hand, you know, there probably should be something about neighborhood gestalt, to use a term. We all know examples of what we could probably agree were outlier problems. I think it's in Burlingame where the Flintstone house is along 280. Or now it's called the dinosaur house because now there's dinosaurs all over the yard as well. That might not be ideal for any Palo Alto neighborhood. There's also very, very strict guidelines, dictates in Woodside. The last time I checked, there seems to be only 2 paint colors you can use. So showing those is just sort of the outer boundaries, but working with this tension, I think maybe we can make some progress. So, you know, the idea of a ad hoc committee with ARB, I think would be really helpful to just kind of drill down on some of this tension area. So I appreciate the comments there of my colleagues. In general, I think the ARB comments were very helpful. I was really impressed with the summary, which I know is also the report writer. So thanks to Gene on that. But some of the things that are there, I think, you know, absolutely, we need to incorporate in that, including transitions, design principles, and so on. But the toughest one of all, I think, was that first one of overly prescriptive. You know, the time, character. I mean, the history of a personal area, or as Commissioner Riggs said, you know, the Eichler neighborhood. We would never want to lose that. It's just, you know, 100 years of history or whatever it's been. So I think we got to figure out a middle ground here without, you know, intentionally trying to keep housing from being built. Just let me check. I think I had one question. Yes, on number 6, Gene, I just want to make sure I was understanding that the legislative actions you're talking about here are ARB or PTC, or that's the legislature that you're talking about, I think. And here in your slide, are you saying that it might be time to go beyond the overlays and just not use those, such as the affordable housing overlay?
It's just an idea, but yes, basically, if part of the goal in the housing work plan and as part of this SB2 grant is to try to facilitate affordable housing, these overlays provide that opportunity, but they do require discretionary action. And so the PTC and council's review, even though the overlays are pretty clear about what the criteria are for who is eligible for such a project.
Yeah, well, that 2 or 3 of us have had some experience with, for example, the affordable housing overlay, and all 3 of us wanted to make that particular project happen really quickly, and we got pretty bogged down in the legislative process there. I think unnecessarily, and there was also some unnecessary friction that just got in the way of the actual outcome, which we finally got to, but it took a long time. So if there's a way that we can get around that and recognize that one size doesn't fit all, that was kind of the mantra that I was using at the time, which is now 2 years ago, because we have to be flexible, particularly when it comes to affordable housing, if we can find anybody to build it. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And Commissioner Hechtman.
Thank you, Chair Templeton. I think that this effort is long overdue. I think it's unfortunate that it took state action to push Palo Alto to take steps in this direction, but I want to acknowledge what we all know, and that Palo Alto is not alone. Virtually every city and unincorporated county is having a similar discussion because to some extent we're all guilty of the same thing. So I think this is a terrific start. And I'm really impressed with the work by staff, and it seems to me that we clearly chose a couple of highly qualified consultants in Gene and Chris, who bring a lot to the table, and I think that shows in the staff report and the attachments. So I think it's a really good beginning. I think that subjective standards are the hobgoblins of fuzzy planning. I think that they cause delay and uncertainty and inefficiency and frustration and disappointment. And I'm not just talking about for project applicants, I'm talking about neighbors too, neighbors of those projects. And part of the reason is that because they're subjective, there's no clear guidance, and so there's no way to set expectations. You know, things like you must be compatible with, you know, the neighborhood, subjective things like that. So I think that this effort to translate what are currently subjective standards into objective standards is great, and I really and I guess this will prove that I'm a planning nerd. I really enjoyed reading attachment A and seeing an example of converting subjective standards into objective criteria. That really, I got it, you know, reading through that, and I understand it's just an example, but I really got it, and so I appreciate that, and I'm really looking forward to the work of the ARB subcommittee here. I honestly think that they have the really heavy lifting here. We get to perhaps do some kind of policy oversight, but those people on that committee are going to have to figure out the actual numbers to plug in to make these subjective standards objective. And I think, and a number of my fellow commissioners have mentioned it, part of that task is going to be for the ARB members, subcommittee members, to think through how do we have these objective standards, but make them flexible enough to fit differently in different neighborhoods. And I think that's a great challenge. You know, to the extent that we members of the commission can provide support or feedback to the ARB should they need it. I'm not sure they would need our unarchitectural feedback on those things, but I'd be happy to provide it. I think so. The other general comment I'll have is a number of these items 1 through 6 have to do with streamlining our code, and I want to say that I'm in the general sense very supportive of that. I think that many municipal zoning codes are labyrinths that have plenty of traps for the unwary, and to the extent that we can thoughtfully organize this so that it simplifies the process, again, that helps to set expectations and will result in, for example, fewer incomplete letters in that first submission. So I think that that's terrific. And the other general comment I'll make is that I would personally, I am not supportive of this concept of I think we called it a conservative approach to developing these objective standards, where they're so tight that virtually everything falls outside of them. I think that's a kind of facadism in our code that we should avoid. That there should be a reasonable, realistic path to approval following objective standards that most projects can meet and still provide diverse building types appropriate for their neighborhoods. So again, great start, and appreciate being part of this process.
Thank you for your comments, Commissioner Heckman. I see Commissioner Alchek has his hand up. Before we go there, last call on general comments. Please put your hands up if you have any more. And then after we hear from Commissioner Alchek, I'll ask Jean Eisberg to go through starting on recommendation 1, and we'll see if anybody has comments on each of those all the way through. Does that sound good? Okay. All right, guys. Thanks, Commissioner Alchek.
Yeah. So Commissioner Heckman's comments made me think of something else that I think we might want to consider, which is that there are a number of former ARB and Planning Commission members in our community who are prolific architects in our community, and who have demonstrated interest in volunteering their time since they've been on their previous positions. Like, I'll give you an example. Dan Garber, I think, sat in on the CAC at some point, or maybe it was the thing before the CAC. I can't remember, the comprehensive plan committee. And I know Randy Pop, I think at one time, was a chair of the ARB. And there's a part of me that feels like really we should be asking former ARB members and local architects to participate in this process, because I didn't find the comments from the ARB that helpful and illuminating, which is why at the start I suggested, like, either we need to have a much more frank conversation with them to understand just how they work through some of the subjective, or really, actually, if I'm being honest, I think it would be highly valuable to talk to some architects who may have, I mean, in the case of Dan Garber and Randy Pop, they were previous members of the PTZ and ARB respectively. And they also are constantly, working on projects in town. And there's a part of me that thinks that they might be the most, that individuals like that would offer us a real insight into, they might be more willing to sort of demonstrate where the ARB can often get stuck, I don't know. I don't know the right, where there's not a lot of, strong ground to stand on, and it gets wish-washy. And I think I want to just echo Commissioner Heckman's comments, which is that I think the idea of getting overly prescriptive or saying, we would, if we're going to adopt this approach, then let's say you can only use these 2 materials unless you decide to go through our ARB process. That's basically formalizing a subjective review, and I would hate for the end result of this process to be that we just sort of covered ourselves legally, as opposed to actually addressed what is clearly a problem in the review process all across the Bay Area, or the state, if you will, which is that we are succumbing to subjective pressure that may not, that is standing in the way of sort of objectively approvable projects. So I don't know if this is something that Mr. Senig is doing, as an architect, or with your background. I'm guessing you have that sort of knowledge. I don't. So that's basically why I'm thinking to myself, like, I'd love to tap somebody who I know isn't worried about us taking control away from them. There's almost a little bit, I'm a little concerned about asking the individuals who are going to lose power here, how how we would do that. And there's a part of me that wants to ask individuals who may have less at stake in the changes to opine. I'm not sure if that's been done anywhere in the state of California, but I know we have a lot of local architects who might be interested in, and I just want to suggest that we consider that as well.
Great points. Thank you, Commissioner Alchak. I see Commissioner Suma has her hand raised.
Just really quickly, in response to some of my colleagues' comments, I'm actually, to be honest, not, though I asked a question that touched on a form-based response, I'm not a fan of form-based zoning at all and wouldn't recommend it for us. I don't think it's appropriate at all for the kind of city that Palo Alto is. And actually, Dan Garber was co-chair of the comp plan group, so he didn't just drop in once in a while, because I was on that too. And I actually served with Randy Pop on the Development Center Customer Advisory Group for 8 years. So I know all of them, and they're great guys. But I think I also really trust the ARB. I don't know if everybody got a chance to read the minutes or watch the video. They had very thoughtful discussions on it. And the ARB right now, especially, I think, is incredibly responsible about not overstepping any of their bounds and not being overly prescriptive. I didn't get that. And I don't know that I think it's important to remember that it's not just professionals in the field that are affected by development in the city, but also the residents that just use the city. I always like to say that architecture, this makes architects really happy. Architecture is the most important art form. And I say that having gone to art school, because you make a choice to go into the museum, but you have to walk by it. So I think it's important to remember that there's people in the community other than the development community that has a real stake in this. And I don't know if we want to, it's a great idea to ask other architects, but I don't know that we need to, since all the ARB are professional working architects. And I don't think there's going to be any money or any taste right now for forming another committee and slowing down this process that is really a process to adjust in response to state laws that are imposed upon us. So although I love the idea of a joint subcommittee, because not enough of us get to work with ARB, I think. So I think that was an excellent idea. Thank you.
Thank you for those points. All right, Jean, are you ready to take a closer look at points 1 through 6? So if you want to speak to point 1, which is probably one of our meatiest, please raise your hand now. And everybody's going to get no more than 1 bite at the apple for each point, just to keep our meeting running. All right, Commissioner Heckman, you get the first stab.
Well, I'm not, I guess I'm getting to go first makes me the guinea pig here, because I'm not sure exactly for the feedback you're looking for, but I'm supportive of this recommendation. I mean, I think it's I'm looking at this is really the heart of what's being brought to us right now. And so I am in favor of it. And actually on this item, I want to pick up, I think this is the right place to pick up on something that Commissioner Riggs brought up, and at least elevate it to a discussion among the commissioners. And that is really this question of how far should we go at this time on this issue? The staff report and the recommendation, I think, are fairly focused on bringing us basically reacting to state law, and so creating a more objective standards in those areas where state law is telling us that we're going to be limited. Cities are going to be limited to looking at just those standards for those kinds of projects. But my question is should we be stopping there now, or should we be looking at more broadly at most of our developments, whether or not they are subject to the state law objective standards limitations that are, here today, because there could be different ones tomorrow. And so it seems like there are a couple of possibilities there. One is we bite that off now at the same time, and look more broadly at objectifying our zoning code. The other possibility, if there's any appetite for it all, would be to kind of look at this as phase 1, phase 2. Excuse me. Let's right now get through the work of addressing the state law issues, and then let's come back with another round. My fear there is we might not do that in the foreseeable future. So that's my comment on 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Heckman. Just to clarify, what I'm looking for is, Jean, if you could go to the one where you had each recommendation on its own slide, so the little bit more detail, in case there was anything that people wanted to discuss, clarify, adjust, or opine on. Yes, that's exactly it. Exactly as Commissioner Heckman did. That's what I was looking for, in case there was something that you thought needed to be tweaked as they approach this, because as staff mentioned, it'll be going back to the ARB. So if there's anything that we wanted to say, oh, that caught my attention, what if we tweak that? So it's exactly what we're looking for. So thank you. I don't see any other hands up for number 1. Go ahead and raise your hand now if you wanted to speak to this item. Commissioner Alcheck, thank you.
Yeah, this is just a question. One of the recommendations doesn't include reviewing the the steps of our process. Do you think that falls under? Do you think that the steps of our process are in some essence a contact-based approach? I mean, I don't know where that, maybe that's a different recommendation, maybe that's bonus recommendation 7, but to what extent does the timeline of our process play into creating opportunities for more subjective determinations? And I don't know if that fits into this recommendation, sort of reviewing our process and criteria, or is that in your mind a different recommendation?
So maybe I can help to answer both questions, just as far as Mr. Heckman and Mr. Alcheck. As far as, looking at the code more broadly, I think, staff would love to look at the entire code, and many times, after a city updates their comprehensive plan, then the next thing to do would be to update the zoning code. I think given the current budget situation and things like that, that may not be the most doable right this minute. Rachel, Assistant Director, can help with that. But so maybe the phase 1, phase 2, if we just sort of had that direction in the back of our minds, maybe that's good. We can follow up with phase 2 as we have time and funds. I definitely have been working with Jean and Chris, though, to in those design criteria, there are commercial standards as well. And this SB2 funding is really directed more towards residential streamlining. But if we can, bring some of the commercial with us easy enough and streamline that section in a quick fashion, we're going to try and do that as well. So that sort of speaks to the sort of more broad update. As far as our review process, I think we've done things over the years, as Jean was talking about, with site and design review, that no longer is necessary for housing projects. We have tweaked our processes over the years. We weren't anticipating changing those right now, but we're definitely open to hearing that discussion.
Okay, so I'll just add by way of example, because I think it may fall into this category, which is maybe one way of creating stronger objective standards would be to include time, like more shorter time periods of review. So that's a process. The process of our review takes a certain amount of time, and maybe tightening up the schedule by saying that the onus is on staff to get this scheduled sooner and quicker would reduce the to me, there's something subjective about delaying a project by when like a local municipality puts the brakes on their review, or they allow it to take longer than it might otherwise. And that to me is one of the issues that has come up frequently in our state. And so I'm not sure where that fits in, but to the extent that we're revising our design criteria, maybe the schedule of our design review could also be revised in such a way that it provides clarity to applicants. Here's how quickly you should get a response, and failure to respond to you in that, because that's basically what some of the state laws are doing, right? They're saying, here's the timeline, and you can't mess around with the timeline because it wouldn't, anyway. So to the extent that alters the process, okay, but maybe it's in an effort to create a more objective path.
I would just add, I think that's a point, especially in terms of the state law. And someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that part of SB35 also is indicating for those projects to which it applies, they do have a certain number of hearings that can occur. And so even though the objective standards may be applying, there's still, a process to go through. So I believe it's 5 public hearings before the project is approved.
It's not unheard of for a project to go before a planning commission in our state, for example, get feedback, come back with nearly every feedback point addressed, only to have the reviewers on that commission then provide almost 180-degree turnaround. These are the stories you hear that are like the bad ones, and then they go back and suddenly but that's what we had the first time, and you said you hated that. And so to some extent, having a process that limits the number of limits the opportunity for someone to sort of keep wish-washing on a quote unquote subjective or a design opportunity. Anyways, okay, I'll say that.
Well taken. We can take that to the ARB and also see what the other PTC commissioners think.
Yeah. And I do think the objective standards inherently will reduce those numbers of rounds of review type thing.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Suma will be the last speaker on this item.
Just for a point of interest, SB35 already has a review process. It can only be 90 or 180 days. And so the state is, and I think the city in some of its housing work plan has moved towards that. But back to the point, because I think I sort of spoke to this before, I think like most things, I think this is the hardest thing to do that you're proposing, and the devil will be in the details. So I really look forward to reading to understanding how you did this and how it worked out. So that's all.
All right, thank you. Let's take a look at number 2. Raise your hand if you'd like to speak to recommendation number 2. And we might even be able to bundle these all together. 2, 3, and 4 are very similar. So if you'd like to speak to 2, 3, and 4, Commissioner Hechtman.
I wasn't intending to usually go first here, but nonetheless, so these are more, again, organizational 2, 3, and 4 as I'm reading them. Reorganizing our code to make it more user-friendly and more comprehensible. And so I'm supportive of these efforts. I'm not sure this is the right place to bring it up, but maybe number 1 was, but I think it's here in number 2. And that is, I wanted to echo a concern that Commissioner Suma mentioned when she first spoke, because I had the same curiosity or wonder as I reviewed attachment A, and that is when we adopt this revised code and we have these menus to satisfy the objective standards, will the development community naturally gravitate toward the same option in each category so that we, end up with the same building? I mean, maybe option A is, just going to be routinely 30% less expensive than B, C, and D every time, and so everyone's going to go for it. I'm worried about that too. And so what I would ask is if that, I would imagine that the ARB members are thinking about that also. And to the extent they're not, I would just like that mentioned to them that their voices on the commission that would like them to look at that as a part of the work they're doing to try to avoid that trap where everybody is drawn to the same option. So that's it for, again, supportive of 2, 3, and 4 recommendations. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Suma.
Sorry, someone else can go ahead if they want to. I'm speaking a lot. I really approve of a new code section, Title 1824, to get all of that in one place. And I'll speak to 3 and 4 now also. That I think those are just improvements to the organization of the code and don't have as much policy. And just to reiterate my concern about buildings all looking the same. Yeah, so thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm also supportive of 2, 3, and 4. I think anything that improves the usability will also improve efficiency and compliance. So I think those are all great ideas. Appreciate you pulling those together and including that in part of this. Just to chime in on the risk of having multiple buildings, multiple multifamily buildings with affordable housing all looking the same. We should be lucky to have the problem of building numerous affordable housing units. So that's, yeah, just to keep it in context, and understand that it's unlikely that we're going to have a lot of cookie cutter homes here. So just keep that in mind and be realistic about that. However, we don't want it. We don't want to have any kind of, repetitive design. We do have, as someone mentioned, I think it was Chris mentioned, we do have a lot of beautiful architecture here, and people have felt free to get creative, and it has made our community beautiful. So hopefully we can find a way to incorporate that, even if we do put some of these objective standards in. However, I agree with what the other commissioners have said, that is probably ARB territory and less PTC territory. All right, I don't see any other hands up for 2, 3, and 4. So let's move to 5. Please raise your hand if you have any comments on 5. And I believe this one is about incorporating graphics to illustrate standards. Any comments on that? Commissioner Heckman?
Sorry, I'm using my space bar because they're just going to be short. Picture tells 1,000 words. I think more illustrations is better.
Excellent. Thank you. Commissioner Alchek.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo that I'm not speaking on each item because I'm generally supportive of all the recommendations. I think Commissioner Suma said it well, that the devil will be in the details. And then I'll just say on the graphics, I think for the most part, the architects involved in a lot of this development don't need them. But I do think that they go very, very far to helping the public understand what the standards the architects are held to. And so I think that the money spent on graphics is money very well spent. because if you have something easily digestible for the residents who will be interested in understanding exactly how the project, complies, having that will save our staff a lot of time. So I think it's like money now versus a lot more money later. So I think that I think there was a reference to the single family design guide that I think already exists. And I don't know that I've ever seen anything like that in other jurisdictions. That particular guide is really well done. So if there was something with respect to this type of development, I think that would be very well spent money.
Thank you for your comments. Commissioner Suma.
So I'm kind of neutral about the graphics only because the professionals don't need them. And I think that, I don't think they're a bad thing. I'm kind of neutral on them because the professionals don't need them. And I think that interested residents or nearby business people will be looking at the specific plans that the architects are proposing, the applicants are proposing.
Thank you for your comments. I'm a little on the fence about this as well. I do think that potentially at the start, including them as examples could be helpful to the public, but we don't want to accidentally go down the path of being too prescriptive. And if they somehow become interpreted as suggestions rather than examples, we could run that risk. So if we do have the option to show, here's an example of a building that passed through our screen, that might be a better type of illustration because it would be more obvious that that's not a prescription, but an example. So just think about that fine line there. And I think to our earlier point about cookie cutter design, that may help reduce the risk of having designs that are too similar. Okay, let's move on to number 6. Raise your hand if you'd like to speak to recommendation number 6. And then after we go through this, we will have one last chance for any questions that have not yet been answered. And then we will probably close this item. All right. Commissioner Riggs, followed by Commissioner Suma.
My question, my comment is actually more on number 5, which is I guess I just want to distinctly disagree with you and Commissioner Suma in that I actually think graphical standards are extremely effective at articulating the intent of the zoning code. So I actually think recommendation number 5 is extremely important, and so I would be very disappointed if this was omitted from what was submitted by the consultant.
Thank you for chiming in on that. I think it's definitely important to hear the different perspectives here. So thank you very much. Commissioner Suma.
Okay, so this is on 6. I'm just always very much in favor of including the public in the process, and we're kind of already been towards a path of kind of limiting that. So I would not be so excited about this, with probably the exception of the affordable housing, but that housing overlay has a lot of fast tracking in it already. So, and the PTOD, I don't know, maybe it will be used more in the future, but it's been around for a long time, and there's only 2 buildings that were applications that ever used it. So I'm not sure how important that is.
Thank you. Any other comments on recommendation number 6? Commissioner Hechtman.
Thank you, Chair. So I think was number 6 one of the ones that staff was particularly seeking PTC feedback on?
Yes, Commissioner Heckman, it is. Oh, whoa, that was weird. It is in part because kind of to the question of like where the PTC's roles fit, this is one of the actions that the PTC would take in terms of the legislative action rezoning to say, yes, you can use a workforce housing overlay. And so perhaps to Commissioner Lowing's earlier point, if that was not a process that projects had to go through and get agendized here and then a council, et cetera, they just knew I met the criteria and I can have workforce housing overlay, that might entice more folks to use it and perhaps result in the types of housing that are suggested by each of the overlays.
All right, so since staff is asking, specifically asking us for feedback, I want to try to provide some, but I guess I'm feeling a little dense on this topic right now, and I'm just feeling like I'm not entirely understanding it. So are we talking here about taking something that today would require legislative action, which would be, I guess, a PTC recommendation and a council decision, and coming up with a set of criteria that if those criteria are met, then that project does not come to the PTC for recommendation and does not go to the council for a decision. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, that is correct. And there may be, just to kind of, not to try to confuse it, but I know that Gina had a slide kind of showing the different kind of scenarios of when does a project go to which, review body. So I imagine there could be still aspects of that project that may need PTC or council approval, but it wouldn't be the workforce housing overlay, for example, that is what would need the approval.
Okay. So I'll be very curious to hear what the council thinks about losing projects that might otherwise come before it. I think this is something that we should explore further. I don't think it should die here tonight. Are there, and maybe they're on the screen in front of me and I'm just not understanding them, are there particular examples that staff has in mind of this would be a good kind of project that maybe if we could have objective standards, it doesn't have to go through PTC and council?
Jody, are there projects that you've reviewed with these overlays or just other projects that might illuminate kind of what we're describing for Commissioner Heckman?
So I think we've, these two overlays, so the workforce housing was created for the project that's at, I want to say 2755 El Camino, which is the old VTA lot. So that has workforce housing as part of it. This overlay was created for that project. But we didn't have the code in effect yet. So it did have to go through that legislative process, which did, take a little bit more time. So that's an example of the workforce housing. For the affordable housing project, a little bit more south on El Camino, 3705 El Camino, off corner of Wilton Court, is our 100% affordable housing project that we just did. And that's where this overlay comes into play and how it started.
Yeah. So that maybe gives you a little color. Okay, go ahead, Amy, if you have another project or example, it'd be great.
Oh, just I was going to address the PTOD. I mean, that's very long in the tooth. That's way back in 2005, I think, that was born before these other ones. And it's just an example of, where you had to go and rezone each site to put the PTOD, even though it was within an area that we said PTOD makes sense. So that was definitely an impediment to anybody coming forward and saying, well, yeah, I want to go through this long rezoning process to put more housing, and then how many housing units did we get? 4 units here, 8 units there. It wasn't a lot. But that PTOD, the way it's written and the way it's processed could be changed up, and it could be applicable to university, our biggest station. So just an example.
And I think the last thing I would say is that, these actions, so let's say we did say, okay, workforce housing, here's the criteria, your project meets it. That project could be not using objective standards. So it could still need design review and other things related to it. It may need a variance or other types of discretionary permissions, which may bring it in front of various approval bodies. So it really is kind of just saying, if we have criteria for these specific overlays, can a project know that I will have that overlay, I will have that, those benefits that come along with it, versus needing to ask for it and possibly be denied, even if I meet these criteria.
Okay, all right.
And we have seen that interest with the last one on the table here, the housing incentive program, where that is more of a guaranteed FAR. And so we have one project coming through the system. We have a second project proposed on San Antonio. And so we'll see where those go.
All right. That was very helpful. I appreciate all staff additional explanation. So I think I would be supportive of moving forward in this direction. And I guess where I'm coming from is that council will ultimately get to approve the overlay, which would thereafter allow faster access. So they will be in this rethinking into objective criteria, they would essentially be the gatekeeper, and they will get to decide up front what are the criteria that will allow people to pass through without coming back to see us. And so I think that will give the council sufficient control that hopefully they could be comfortable with it. And so I would encourage staff to move forward with recommendation number 6.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Heckman. Vice Chair Rupivar.
I was having the same lack of understanding as Commissioner Heckman, so thank you for the clarification. Are the current standards fairly non-controversial? Is that why we're thinking that these, the ones that you called out, that would be easy to put together objective standards? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would hesitate to say anything is not controversial. That many items have constituencies, but I think your point is taken of how easy or simple might it be to create the standards? Are they already embedded in the overlays?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you want to address that, kind of where they are now and kind of how that body of work might look for becoming objective criteria? Or Jean, if you'd like to address it.
I think just these overlays, I was trying to pull up the code quickly here, but most of these are fairly limited about where they can be applied. And so, the council could decide if they want to limit it further. But they do most of them allow more FAR and less parking and things of that nature. That's where some of the controversy comes in. But we were able to approve them the first time around because we limited the locations.
And those geographic locations could be maintained if that was what was put forward.
Thank you.
All right. I'm also supportive of recommendation number 6. So, all right, last call. If you have any other comments, general, whatever, raise your hand. All right, and staff, are you feeling like you've gotten what you need out of this discussion? Was there anything specific that you were looking for that we may have left out?
Yeah, I'll say it's been really helpful. Jody, I see Jody nodding, so I think she's gotten what she needs to be able to move forward. I really thank you guys for tackling this. One thing I did want to comment on, and Albert, feel free to jump in if you need to, in regards to if we wanted to establish a joint subcommittee on this topic, we would need to take that recommendation to the city council to have them establish a formal joint ARB and HRB subcommittee, which would then be kind of a Brown Act group. But we could also ensure that we could just provide informational updates at these meetings to provide more insight. I don't know if HRB members could interview the PTC members or something as part of their outreach, but there may be other ways to gain participation if there is either not will to have a subcommittee or if that just seems procedurally challenging. Albert, I don't know if you want to put any more color on the restrictions or kind of the process to have a subcommittee.
No, I think you covered it. Thanks, Rachel.
Okay.
I think being able to reach out to people that have expressed interest in answering questions or being available should the ARB subcommittee want to would be fine. So if there's any commissioner here who would like to make themselves available, then we don't have to do a subcommittee. We could be, willing to chime in. And if you're not ready tonight or you need to think about it, you could of course email Rachel and myself and let us know. Commissioner Suma.
Oh, I was just going to say, alternatively, a joint subcommittee sounds like a lot of work for staff right now. Alternatively, we could have a study session, which might be a much less laborious thing for staff.
I think that's a great suggestion.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. I see.
That'd be fun.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for
great
suggesting that. All right. Last call. Any more thoughts, contributions, etc.? All right. So we will end the discussion of agenda item number 2. All right. There's no minutes to approve, I believe. Is that right?
That's correct. We have no minutes for this meeting.
Okay. So then committee items. Any updates? Raise your hand if you have any updates from. Okay. And we heard earlier that the NVCAP will be meeting later this month on Zoom. So it might be an interesting opportunity to listen in if you're available. All right, Commissioner questions, comments, announcements, and future agenda items. Commissioner Suma.
Sorry, I must be lonely. I'm so chatty tonight. I just wanted to thank Vin for the great job he's doing organizing all the Zoom meetings. He also does the ARB, I noticed as I've watched ARB Thursday, and it's just been going really smoothly. He's been doing a great job, even when idiots like me can't find my invitation at the last minute. So thank you, Vin.
My pleasure.
Yes, thank you, Vin. All right, any comments on future agenda items from staff?
Yeah, so next week, or not next week, in 2 weeks, on the 27th, which is our next meeting, we're going to be having that parking ordinance with the electric vehicle charging return, as well as ADU ordinance. So those will be 2 big topics. And then as you heard, the study session item will be the planning and transportation update regarding parking. So I know it's 3 items that are pretty meaty, but one, you've at least a little bit familiar with the EVSE and ADU ordinance. While it's perhaps new, it's not the very, very first time that we're tackling ADUs, but I think we've done a lot of good streamlining there. And so hopefully you'll find it easy to read, and that will be something that we look forward to seeing. So should be a really good meeting, and thank you guys in advance for your participation in this virtual setting.
Thank you. And just to mention, in case there was any planned absences, you can speak to those now as well for the upcoming meetings. I know we're about to head into summer and everybody's got all those canceled vacation plans. So
a big trip planned. It's gonna be fun time.
Sorry. I mean, it's sometimes you just gotta laugh or you're gonna cry.
Yeah.
So all right. Then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody, for all your patience and flexibility on dialing in from Zoom. You've made it through another one, so thank you so much. All right, good night, everybody.
Bye.